So I decided to make another art piece about the situation we're in 2020. Back in 2019, there were some economists that were predicting a recession was on the horizon because of what we call the yield curve. Basically, when you invest in U.S. treasuries, when you loan money to the federal government, the longer terms you loan the money to the government, the higher the interest rate generally is, right? Because you're tying up money, you're taking up a number of risks, right? The risk of default is presumably very low, but you're tying up your money and taking a risk that interest rates might change, and if they go higher, then the money you loaned earlier at the agreed upon lower rate now has a lower value because you could have invested it at a higher rate today, right? You're taking on an inflation risk, right? If you're doing it from another country, you're also taking a foreign exchange risk, right? And but last year, we noticed that people were willing to lend the federal government money at a lower rate for a longer term, right? The 10-year rate was lower than the 2-year rate, which basically means that people don't see any other safe alternative to investing their money, right? Because if you invested in a bank deposit, a CD, or a money market, it's only insured up to $250,000, right? And the big players are probably going to be investing in treasuries instead. And there was some doubt about what that meant. And it didn't take long before we had another curve that went flat, right? Or that we hope would go flat, right? The number of cases of COVID-19. At the beginning of the crisis, in case you guys have all forgotten, we presumed that COVID-19 was going to affect basically everybody, right? Except for the few people whose genes didn't allow themselves to be infected with COVID-19. The idea of flattening the curve was that if we practice some good hygiene and social distancing and travel restrictions and just and shutting down non-essential businesses and all that, that the same number of people would be infected, but we could spread them out. And if this is healthcare capacity, right, we could avoid some of these deaths that would have occurred, right, just by spreading it out. It would make the crisis last longer, but healthcare wouldn't be overwhelmed, right? That was the initial goalpost. Unfortunately, a lot of that has been forgotten. I haven't heard the term flatten the curve for quite some time. And actually, when I looked it up to see what they were talking about now, I actually found that concept instead. And so when we first started doing that, the Dow Jones Industrial Average crashed from 30,000 down to 19,000. It was probably already in a bubble to begin with because of that, right? History has shown every time that happens, we're in a bubble, and COVID was more of a catalyst for causing that bubble to collapse, right? It was probably overdue. It reminds me of in 1985, the U.S. dollar was way overvalued, and it was in a bubble, right? The Japanese yen, the German mark, what were the other currencies at the time? The Swiss franc. They were in an anti-bubble, and a lot of speculators kept buying dollars, and then the Plaza Accord comes along where the major banks decide to sell U.S. dollars, but it was a tiny amount of U.S. dollars they were selling compared to the market, right? The U.S. dollar supply at the time was in the trillions. They sold a few billion, and the dollar crashed by 50% over the next 2 years. It was called the slap in the face, right? The markets were going crazy, and something comes along to allow investors to get out, right? To let them know that maybe it's a good time to get out, and they do, and the markets revert to the normal, right? Thanks for watching.